Episode 4. In this episode, we're going to implement modifier keys for common modifiers like Shift, Alt, and Ctrl. We'll use a similar setup to the previous episode, but instead strictly only override already existing inputs rather than switch to a different mode with potentially different inputs like before. We'll also implement a custom trigger by implementing a double tap trigger. So the input requires a double click action to trigger the input event triggered. We'll start in the C++, setting up our data file. So we're going to be adding a few new sections here. So I'm going to add a section for the modifier keys, and then I'm going to add separate sections for the mappings. So we'll have a shift mapping, an alt mapping, and a control mapping. So in the default mappings area, I'm going to just add the double tap for later. We'll implement that towards the end of the video. So we'll need just inputs for our modifier keys. Pretty straightforward, those ones. I'll just be bool value types. And then for our mapping context, each one's going to have a context and a priority. What we're going to use our modifiers for is select for this example, and we're going to have a custom action for that, and then we'll change the bindings for select to do different things. And the other thing we want to add is another template. There's two ways you can do this. Is for the modifier keys. I'll just add this in. I'm just going to call it bind input simple, and it's just passing two functions. So it's going to bind two events. I'm using started and completed. You can use triggered here, but what you'll need to do is you'll need to add a modifier pressed, so it only triggers the trigger event once. The reason why I'm using started is it'll only trigger once. So when we hold shift, it'll just toggle on and it'll toggle off when it's completed, aka when you let go. Rather than if I use triggered here, it'll just spam the on feature, which we don't want. So that's that. Let's go to our player pawn. So I'm just going to put in a section for our modifier keys in between here. We're going to need a few functions for our select modifiers. So we're going to have a shift select, an alt select whole. No, we don't need that. An alt select end and a control select and a control select end. And they're just essentially overrides for those select functions. So let's bind these first. So for shift, put in a new section to keep it neat. So here I'm just binding that simple, and it's just going to call shift twice, and you'll see the setup. It's going to use the bool value type to check if it's finishing or starting. Alt will be the same, just using a double alt. Here though, we're replicating the select feature here. So we're basically doing a select, but we're replacing some of the functions with different functions. So select hold is still does the same job, so we don't need to override it. But there's different things we want to do in the end and the start here. And then control, same thing as alt, doing the two controls, and we're overriding the start and the end functions for the selection. We might add our double tap function here too. I think I forgot to implement that. Yep, so we'll let's go back. We'll just put a double tap in under the default there. Alright, so we should be able to implement all these. Hopefully not in line. Alright, let's start with our modifier keys. I'm going to check that we've got a reference to our player controller, and it's going to be the same and everything. So I'm just going to, anything we're doing a select in is going to need a reference to the player controller. So back at our shift, we're going to add, this is where we'll enable the context for shift. So we haven't set this up in the player controller yet, but we're basically going to set input shift, which will bring in the override for the key inputs. And we're passing through the bool here to say whether we want to enable it or disable it. And that's where so at the start, it'll be true. And on the completed, it'll be false because it's no longer active. We'll add some debug here. So we'll add, just so we can see it easier when we get into the editor. We'll add a simple log just to show if it's working or not. Put in our value. And the others are going to be the same, so we'll do Alt, and that's going to enable the Alt context, and Control is going to enable the Control context. We've just got some debug to show those are on and off. Now for Shift Select, I just needed something to demonstrate a different select. In my game I'm working on at the moment, Shift Select selects a formation, so it could be groups or something like that. So what I'm going to do just to simulate it, I'm just going to select all players, all characters or units or whatever within a certain range. And if I select nothing, it's just going to deselect whatever's selected as usual. So normally you'd have a list of your actors in your game. You wouldn't have to iterate over all this, but this is just a demonstration of what you can do. Like for example, when we were placing actors in the previous episode, we'd normally just add them to a global array, say on the player controller, saying this is the character's units and this is what you'd iterate over to select things and do whatever. For this, I'm just going to get the class of whatever I've clicked on. And if I haven't clicked on anything, I'm going to deselect everything. But if I have selected on something, I get its class, and I get all those actors of the class, and then I check if they're in this range, and then add them to a selection array. Alright, for Alt Select, so it's going to be like a deselect. So the reason why I wanted to make a separate one instead of using the normal select is, if you have a look at normal select up here, find it, here it is. It actually deselects everything first. So that keeps, so when you're just left clicking individual units, it selects that one unit. It doesn't maintain, so you don't select the first one and then you select the second one, you've got two selected. It will actually deselect everything and then select whatever you're selecting on. So we don't want that to happen with Alt Select. We want it to just deselect whatever we select on. So if you've got multiple selected, you can Alt Select one and just deselect that one. So we're going to have the same as Select, but just without that deselect at the start. And at the end, obviously we don't want to select, which is the normal end selection. So we're just going to modify the selection to pass a deselection. Now we don't have a deselection, a public deselection if you've been following along in the player controller. We'll add that again when we get to the player controller. It's just we do have a deselect function, but it's not public, that's all. And the other thing we want to change is our selection box. So our selection box really wasn't set up to handle deselection in a box format. So we can easily do that by passing in a boolean of whether we want to select or deselect. So we're just going to update that quickly, and I might just do that now. So for end, we want to just have a bool here. I'm going to call it deselect. Actually, later on, we're going to need an add as well. So we're going to add that now too. I'm just going to make that another bool that comes through. I'm going to set these with defaults, so I don't have to pass them if I'm just using the defaults, which will be the most common ones. And then in the actual function to use those, what we want to do is we want to replace the selection here to only if we're selecting, we want to add the selection, and if we're not, we want to remove the selection. Check if it's select or if it's not select, and then call the appropriate function. And again, we'll handle that deselection in the. So basically, we're saying if we're selecting, select who's in the box. We're not selecting, deselect who's in the box. And now for the add only, that's for the control. See, with control, we want to hold control and want to be able to add individual units. So the opposite to alt. When it comes to, if we control box select, we want to add those units. We don't want to remove them. And we also, if we select nothing while we're holding control, we don't want to deselect everything that we've selected. So just to prevent that, we're just going to add a check in here. So we only want to deselect if we're not adding. So basically, if we're not holding control and we select nothing, deselect everything. That's all we need to do in there. And you can see now, like the other instance of where I'm using this, I haven't had to change it because I've set the default. The default box select is true. It wants to select, so I don't have to update it. Right, so I can do the control now. Control select is actually the same as alt select, just taking out we don't want to deselect stuff if we don't select on anything. We could actually just pass in alt select as it's the same thing. So in our bindings, we could set it where we've set control select, we could select alt select, but I'll just create the new function here. It's the same code. Generally bad practice to do repetitive code, but we're just doing it for the sake of demonstration here. So on the selection end, we need to pass that new variable to our box select. So that'll be the true there to say we're only adding. If we don't select anything, don't deselect everything. And we're also different to normal is we're actually checking, if we're not doing a box select and we selected nothing, it's alt select, sorry, that's not the right one to look at. Go to normal selection end. So select end, if we're not doing a box select, it'll pass through this object. And if we select nowhere, it'll pass null and it'll deselect everything. So we need to avoid that in this. And that's another reason why we have to redo our control select end is because we just want to check that we actually have hit something and select it. But if we miss something while holding control, we don't want to deselect everything. So we're just going to do nothing. All right, let's get to the player controller now. So let's add our public deselect. So let's make two selections like we've got here. And we'll just change into deselect. Deselect, so I can deselect the group as well. We'll need that for the box select deselect. In the handle deselect, we just want to check that that's actually a valid actor. If it's already selected, then we'll send it to the server to deselect. And then for the group deselect, we're just going to pass it to the server to deselect. We don't actually have a server deselect, so we'll add that as well. So what we need to do for our server deselect group is we want to iterate through whatever we're passing in the array, check that that index is valid, and then we want to iterate through our selected backwards so we can remove if when we find the one that we're checking at that iteration. So the if you try and remove on a forward loop, the indexes of the array will change and it will explode. So we can just break out of this for loop when we find the one that we want, go to the next one, check if it's in selected. If it is, remove it. Because it's going from the end, it'll maintain the indexes of the array. And then at the end, just replicate the new selected list. So let's set up our new input modes. So we're going to need 3 new ones for Shift, Alt, and Control. Don't know why it does that. Anyway. Now these are very similar to this up here, so I'm not going to bore you with the details. You can see what's there. So if you copy paste this and then change the context and the context priority, you're done. Or adding or removing the context, like so. Back in our player pawn, don't think we implemented our double tap. So just demonstration purposes for double tap, I'm just going to have it delete whatever actor we double click on. Or character, I should say. So again, like you'd have your actors to iterate over, but I'm just going to check that whatever I double clicked on is the top-down character. If it is the top-down character, I'm going to just remove it from the selection and then destroy it. So we'll fire that up. We will have to come back for C++ to implement our custom trigger, but we'll get this set up first. So let's go back to the editor. Right, in the editor, we've got a few things to add here. So we're going to add some new folders. Going to add Shift, Alt, and Control. Keep it sorted. In the default, we're going to add Select, double tap. We'll come back to that. Alt, we're going to need our standard. These could go in default, but I thought we've got a folder named Alt. Might as well put them all in there. So this will be IA Alt, and we had duplicate this IA Alt Select, and then Control was the same. IA Control, IA Control Select, IA Shift, IA Shift Select, and now we want to go to our context. We'll update our default first, so we need to add Alt, Control, like so. So that'll allow us to, in our default input mode, allow us to enable the other modes. I'll add double tap while we're in here. And that'll just be left mouse. it works, and we'll add the trigger when we make it back in here later. So what we'll do is we'll duplicate default and we'll remove some things because we're going to modify how it treats some inputs. We want them in there. We'll save us adding them. Start with shift. So for shift, what I want to do is when I hold shift, I'll move faster and I'll zoom faster. So we don't need select because we're implementing a custom select. Or hang on, we can just change that to shift select. And then we don't need rotate, don't need free look. I mean, if you've got keys that you want shift modifiers for this stuff, like you can do it, and we don't need that, and we don't need these. What I want to do for zoom is I'm going to actually add the modifier in here. I'm going to use scalar, and I'm basically just going to increase the input. I'll make it something huge so we can actually see it easy. You can tweak those values, but it'll do the same for WASD. Scalar 5, 5. It doesn't matter about Z actually. It's only a vector 2, so. Right, that is shift set up. Let's duplicate shift for alt because we're going to do a similar thing. Alt's going to be half speed on the move and zoom. You get the finer movement when you want it. So all the scalar values, we can just change them to 0.5. So that's that. And then for our IA shift, we want to change it to IA select alt, or alt select. And that doesn't need any modifiers. So that's alt done. And for control, we'll just add a new context. IMC control. And we're just going to add the single IA control select with the left mouse button. Let's go. Actually, we'll come back and go to set our data. We'll create that class for the custom trigger now. Put in input. It's trigger type. Input trigger is the base class. And you'll see the other ones here. You can actually open these up and see how they do the triggers and use what they've got to make anything you need by modifying it. But we'll just use the base input trigger for this one. I'll just call it input trigger double tap. First thing we need to add is the uClass header info here, so it's not blueprintable, and this is where it'll set the name for what it displays as. And this minimal API means you can't use the API here if you're getting this error, just because it's a minimalistic class. Saves on some overhead that doesn't need. So this is pretty much taken from those example triggers. Double click has to happen within a certain time period. So this will be the setting that we can set in the trigger, and this will be the time that we last clicked, so we can compare if it's greater than the delay time that's set. Inline stuff is driving me nuts, and we don't need the super, so we just need an include here, enhanced input, enhanced player input there. So we're checking it's pressed. We're getting the actual time that we're at when it was pressed. We're comparing the current time to the last time, and if the time is less than our delay, then it's going to pass back triggered. If it's not, it's going to pass back none. And if it hasn't been triggered, then it's going to update the last tap time. We'll just confirm we did add the IA, the double tap. Yep. All right, let's rebuild. Now the only thing we should have to do is set up our data here. So we've got and set our trigger on our double tap actually. That's double tap, Alt, Control, We need to set our priorities. We need to set our contacts to Shift, Alt and Control. And this is the Shift, Select, the Alt Select, and the Control Select. All set. So our bindings should be good to go. Now let's set our trigger on our double tap. And we're setting it actually in the IA on this one. We could set it in the contact. Given its name double tap, we want it to always be a double tap. And there's double tap. And we should be able to set the time, the delay, can adjust that as needed. And we should be good to go. So if we move forward, hold Shift, goes faster, backwards faster, slower, and then hold Alt, goes super slow. That's working. Check our log. Yep. Control's working. So let's place some units. Shift select, that's selecting all the units within the range. Let's try and Alt select, can remove individuals, and let's Control select. Is not working. Right, I think what I might have forgot to do back in the C++ is on the server select, remove server clear selected. So previously when I was selecting something, it was clearing everything first, and now that we're doing adds to the selection, we do not want to clear every time, only when we pass null. So let's rebuild for that. And if we hold Control, we can add, remove, oh yeah, and our double click, boom, toast. So that concludes episode 4 and this series for now. Thanks if you've watched all the way through. Thanks for watching. If you've got any questions or comments or need a hand, or leave it in the comments or join us on Discord. Thanks very much for watching. See you in future tutorials.